Hey everyone, I don't usually talk about industry news on this channel, but there is something going on that I think everybody should at least be aware of. A huge portion of the entertainment industry at the major level could be on the verge of shutting down entirely because the unions that work on these big films and sets, IATSE, is about to call for a nationwide strike and potentially walk off all of these productions at once. Now, I don't want to get too deep into how it got to this point or the issues that are on the table that are potentially causing this strike, but I do want to talk about the potential ramifications if IATSE does walk off all of these sets and shut down all of these big productions. The first and most obvious thing that would happen if a strike actually goes through is any production that's covered under what's called the basic agreement that IATSE has with a lot of production companies, they'd grind to a total halt. And these are not small, independent productions. This is basically anything under Universal Pictures, anything under Sony or Warner, and this huge list of other production companies that are pretty constantly churning out content, films, and television. So basically any new content that's being produced right now, whether it's currently shooting or it's in post-production or it's kind of at the verge of finishing up, if there is any basic agreement IATSE employee involved in that process, they're going to be out and that content's going to be halted, which is a huge, huge problem for all the companies that are actually producing this stuff. The second thing that'll happen is going to be more of a drawn out process and is kind of a big question mark as to what's going to happen if this strike actually goes through. And that's really how long it's going to last. You can shut down a production for a day and it's going to cost a bunch of money and it's going to be logistically a problem, but you can kind of make up for that if it's just 1 or 2 days that you're out. If it goes on for weeks or months, that's a whole other ballgame. That's a huge amount of money that's been spent or being spent, and it's a huge amount of money that it's costing also the workers here because they're foregoing a lot of wages in doing something like a strike. So this is going to be felt on both sides of the equation here, and it really could come down to who's able to ride out a strike the longest. The union workers, who are the ones actually kind of technically making the content, or the producers who are the ones financing all of this and need the content to come out to recoup those costs. So it's kind of a big question mark at the moment. There are also a lot of details in this that can really easily go overlooked, but are really, really important and can be costly. If you've got a whole bunch of rental equipment, which is very common to have on big productions, if everybody walks off the set, does that rental equipment need to go back to a rental house so it can still be rented out? Or is it still booked? Does that money still need to go to that rental house? Is anybody even going to be willing to pay for it at that point because there's a strike going on? And if so, where does that money come from? It's really, really costly to shut down a whole production for a long period of time. And again, this doesn't really have a clear ending in sight. It could go on for a couple of weeks, or it could go on for months, depending on all kinds of different factors. And there are questions like, does production insurance cover things like this? Is it down to each individual production? Is it down to each individual crew member? What kind of deals are in place right now that might affect one production differently than another, even though they're covered under the same basic agreement by the IATSE? Now, it's important to note that every 3 years, this contract in question, the basic agreement, is renegotiated by the IATSE and the producers, the AMPTP. So they come down, sit down at a bargaining table, and everybody kind of figures out what it is they want from each other and how to go forward for the next 3 years. After being shut down for the last year and a half, the stakes have never been higher for both parties involved. So it's really, again, a complicated situation with a lot more tension and pressure than there ordinarily would be. There are two big conversations going on right now that kind of fall outside what's considered normal for these contract negotiation years. The first is what to do about big streaming companies. A company like, say, Universal Pictures or like Disney, these have been around for a long time. Universal's actually over 100 years old at this point. This is not a new company. They're known quantities, and these kinds of organizations have been going back with each other for quite some time. Netflix is not that old, and especially now that there are companies like Google or Facebook or Snapchat or Apple getting into the content creation space, there's a lot of dialogue about how to handle them, how to classify the kind of work that they do, because these are not traditionally film production companies. They're tech companies making technology products. As far as these contracts are currently concerned, companies like that fall under new media, which is a totally different subset of agreements and a different contract that is kind of aimed at lower budget and less prevalent sorts of technologies. And That's obviously not the case. Streaming has blown up, and I know it's cliche to say, but it's changed how everybody views content and how everybody consumes content. Netflix, for example, which was historically a distribution platform and didn't make any of its own content, has obviously been making more content than most film studios are able to. They reported 200 million subscribers earlier this year. At $8.99 a month, that's almost $1.8 billion a month in revenue, which is crazy. And naturally, there's a lot of disagreement over how that money should be handled and where it should be allocated as far as productions and employees go. The other conversation is about how the strike is actually going to get handled and how long it's going to go on, how to ride that out if and when it does actually occur. Now, it's not for sure yet if this strike is going to be called. Currently, there's an authorization vote that needs to take place where the union members under the IATSE banner all come together and say, yes, we're able to strike, or no, we're not able to. If these negotiations between IATSE and the AMPTP start back up and IATSE is able to say, we're ready to strike and walk out of all your sets if you don't meet whatever terms we've got, that could be a big financial threat to the AMPTP if IATSE walks in and says, we're ready to walk off all of your sets unless you give us what we want, whatever that might be. On the flip side of that, if they don't come to the table with the ability to go on strike, all bets are off, and the AMPTP has the ball in its court to be able to dictate terms that may or may not be acceptable to IATSE, again, depending on which side of the fence you're on. The other component of that is how potentially striking union members are going to continue bringing in money and income while they're striking from union sets. And this is kind of a technical detail that I haven't seen talked too much about, but I think it's really important to know. In order to work on these major feature films and television shows, you generally have to be a part of these unions. And if you're not, then you're not able to work on them. However, if you're in the union, there is no stipulation that says you can't take on non-union work. So all of these union members, if they strike, are going to potentially be flooding the non-union labor market as highly skilled and well-paid individuals with a lot of experience. So that could cause some potential chaos on a lot of non-union productions and independent productions, because all of a sudden, a lot of people who are ordinarily booked up on these big union shows that you have to be in the union to be a part of are going to be looking for non-union work to supplement as they boycott these other productions. And it's anybody's guess as to how that's actually going to shake out, whether people are going to be able to hold down their jobs or not, or if companies are going to be more willing to hire on these striking union workers into independent productions. Nobody really knows how this is going to shake out, because IATSE as a whole, all of these different technical unions, haven't had a strike like this in decades. So this is kind of new territory in a lot of ways for everybody involved, and it's going to be really interesting and complicated in how it shakes out. At the end of the day, no one really knows what's going to happen, but if you're a filmmaker of any kind, whether you're in the union, out of the union, or didn't even know the union existed in the first place, I'd encourage you to check all this information out for yourselves and draw your own conclusions, figure out what's happening, and just be aware of what's going on, because there could be a lot of things changing and a lot of things up in the air going forward in a really, really short amount of time here. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, you enjoyed the content, and this was informative. If you did find it interesting, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe. Comment below with what you think might happen or how this may or may not affect you. I'd be really curious to hear some feedback from everyone. I'm over on Instagram at AXK, so come follow me over there. If you want to support the channel, head over to my website, alexknickerbocker.com. You can choose how you want to contribute if you're up for it. Thanks for watching, and I guess we'll see what happens.